Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. As you see from the title, today's episode is going to be about timing and priority. Now, if you've played Magic for a while, and especially if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, it's almost certain that you've heard these terms before. But maybe you don't have a really clear technical idea about what exactly they mean. And that is something that I've seen a lot in my own play experience, which is that a lot of the time, Magic players have a kind of colloquial understanding of how timing and priority works, but they aren't super familiar with all the technical details. And so I wanted to make a video where I talked about that. So, what is priority? And really simple, priority is just how the game decides who gets to act when two players want to take a game action at the same time. And, I feel like most people probably would understand this definition of priority. This is kind of the colloquial definition. The rules kind of have a similar definition, but maybe with a little bit more legalese thrown in there. But I think that this is a pretty good starting point for most people. So priority is how the game decides who gets to act when two players want to take a game action at the same time. And of course, Magic isn't really set up in such a way where that would be something that's possible, unlike some other games. And so, with that being the case, Magic needs some sort of a system in order to make sure that if two people do want to take a game action at the same time, then there's a defined way to decide who gets to actually have priority to act first. That way, there isn't some sort of a race condition where the answer would be undetermined or based on like whoever gets to like yell loudest or talk fastest or something. So okay, what uses priority? And this is where people start. I think maybe having a little bit of a situation where they're getting let down by the colloquial wisdom. So this stuff over here, the stuff on the left, is actually the only stuff in the game where you would actually need priority. So casting a spell, activating an ability, or taking a special action, such as, for example, making a land play, or suspending a card, or turning face up a face down creature that you had morphed. All of that stuff would be things that you would need priority in order to do. And then you've got like this next class of things, which I'll kind of label as stuff that's kind of related to priority. So triggered abilities and state-based actions don't actually need priority to function, but they do use priority in the way that they operate. So for example, triggered abilities get put onto the stack at the time when a player is about to get priority. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly how that process works a little bit later in the video. But the same thing is true for state-based actions. They also get put onto the stack when a player is about to get priority. So they use that as a little bit of a trigger to decide when those things actually physically happen in the game. And so likewise, kind of turn-based actions do not rely on timing and priority. They don't rely on the priority to happen. Turn-based actions would, of course, be things like drawing a card at the beginning of your draw step or declaring attackers at the beginning of the declare attacker step. And actually, the way that these are related to priority is in fact, in any of those steps, the first person to get priority gets it after the turn-based actions that are associated with that step have been completed. And so you can see that the turn-based actions don't rely on priority, but priority happens after the turn-based action. So it's kind of like the opposite relationship. And finally, mana abilities. You actually do not need priority to activate a mana ability, and that's because mana abilities do not go on the stack and resolve like a normal activated ability or even like a normal triggered ability. But it turns out that you are able to activate a mana ability anytime that you have priority. However, there's also some other times when it's also possible for you to activate mana abilities. Basically, anytime something in the game is asking you for a mana payment, it is legal for you to activate a mana ability. So, for example, in the middle of casting a spell, there is a step in that process for when you can activate mana abilities to help you get some mana that you can use to pay for that spell. Of course, you would not have priority to cast a spell in the middle of the process of casting a different spell, so that would be like one kind of example where you would be able to activate mana abilities, but you would not be able to say that you had a priority. And then finally, there's this last category of stuff, which is stuff that is not related to priority at all. So like if you are dealing with continuous effects or replacement effects in a question, and you're thinking about like what player has priority, there's a good chance that you're probably barking up the wrong tree, because those two types of rule interactions don't really react with priority in any kind of traditional sense. So that's kind of like a sense of like what sort of things priority interacts with and what stuff it does not. So, okay, how do you get priority? And there's actually four different ways that the comprehensive rules defines, and we'll go over all of them in turn. So the first one is the active player receives priority at the beginning of most steps and phases. And, obviously that makes sense, right? Like, you would expect that the active player, the player whose turn it is, would be the person who gets the first shot at playing a spell during their turn. Obviously that would make sense, and that's, in fact, exactly how it works. And so, as you can see, that happens after any of the turn-based actions that are associated with that step or that phase have been dealt with, and after triggered abilities that trigger at the beginning of that step go on the stack. So that's another kind of important point. So like there's a lot of triggered abilities that say at the beginning of your upkeep, do something. So there's actually no possible way for you to cast a spell or activate an ability at the beginning of your upkeep before triggered abilities that say at the beginning of your upkeep have been put onto the stack, because you would need priority to cast a spell, and you do not get priority to cast a spell until after, as we see there, all of the triggered abilities that trigger at the beginning of that step have been put onto the stack. So the first time you would have a chance to cast a spell during your upkeep would actually be after all of the triggered abilities that trigger at the beginning of your upkeep have already been put onto the stack. And so then we see like there's a couple of kind of oddball cases. So one of them is that no player gets priority during the untap step. There might be some ways to cast a spell during the untap step if you jump through a bunch of wacky hoops, but it turns out there is no way to get priority during the untap step, at least not as far as I'm aware. So it is possible to cast a spell even though you don't have priority in some kind of limited situations. I said that normally you would need priority to cast a spell in the last slide, but it turns out that if you are following the instructions of a resolving spell or ability, then sometimes those instructions would include a line that tells you to cast a spell. Like, for example, if you think about the card Wish, that would be one example of a card that has you cast a spell during its resolution. And so in that situation, it is possible for you to cast a spell without having priority. And I made a whole video about that. I published it a while back, so you can take a look at that video if you'd like some more in-depth description of exactly how that process works. But again, no player gets priority during the untap step, even if you might cast a spell at that time. So, but even to cast a spell during your untap step requires a lot of jumping through some hoops. So players also usually don't get priority during the cleanup step. However, if a triggered ability triggers during the cleanup step or a state-based action happens during the cleanup step, then actually you would get priority because you would have, the game would progress to the next step by using the normal criterion that it does. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that turn structure stuff works. But in those cases, you actually would get priority during the cleanup step, but normally you would not. Players usually do not get priority during the cleanup or the untap steps. So, but with the exception of those, at the beginning of every step, the active player gets priority. And then, obviously we need priority to go to somebody. The active player is kind of the natural choice for who would get priority first. Okay, so the next way to get priority is actually kind of a little bit more straightforward. The active player also receives priority after any spell or ability other than a mana ability resolves. And so remember we said in the previous slide that with mana abilities, it's possible to activate a mana ability even if you do not have priority. And so with that being the case, that's the reason why we have that exception there. If you have a spell or ability resolve, it wouldn't make sense for a player to get priority after a mana ability resolves if we, for example, played that mana ability during a time when we didn't already have priority. We aren't going to give someone priority in the middle of casting a spell because we used a mana ability during the process of casting that spell. So that makes sense too, I think. And then the next one is kind of similar. If a player has priority when they cast a spell, activate an ability, or take a special action, then that player receives priority afterwards. And remember, we said before a little bit here that it's possible to cast a spell without having priority if you are instructed to cast that spell during the resolution of another spell. So that's the reason why we have this line here that says if a player has priority when they cast a spell or activate ability or take a special action, then they get priority again afterwards. So you would need to have priority in order to get priority after. But generally, when you're casting a spell, you would be able to have the first opportunity to respond to that spell, and that's kind of an interesting thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the consequences that has in the future for this video here. But the last way to have priority would be if you have priority and don't take any actions, then you pass priority. And so if you were to pass priority, then that would mean that the next person in turn order would then get priority. And interestingly enough, there's also this line here that says if there's any mana in your mana pool when you pass priority, then you are supposed to announce what mana there is in there. I've never actually seen somebody do this, and I think probably most players and maybe even most judges are not even familiar that this is something that you are supposed to do. But yes, technically, you are supposed to say what mana is in your mana pool every time you pass priority. It doesn't really come up very often, and I'm not sure if I would really give someone a penalty for failing to do this unless I thought that there was a reason to believe that they were cheating or trying to cheat. But in any case, that's the more you know. So now you know about that, and if that does come up in one of your games, you'll know exactly like what the correct protocol was supposed to be. So the important thing about that rule is, of course, that if you have priority and then you pass priority, in other words, if you choose not to do anything with it, then the next person would get priority. And those are the 4 ways that priority can go to a player is through one of these 4 things happening in the game. And every single priority thing that happens in the game, the player who has priority got it through one of those 4 methods. So that might be a kind of a fun exercise that you could try to do. If you're having fun at home playing along, maybe if you're bored during the next, waiting for your turn of the next EDH game or something, you could maybe think about which of these 4 things is giving each player priority every time that they have priority. So that's kind of a cool way to hone your skills while you're waiting for the next time you get to take a game action. So, all right, what happens when you pass priority? And this is kind of like what we were talking about before. The way that Magic turns are structured is that progressing from step to step or from phase to phase is entirely predicated on passing priority, or at least for the most part, except for the untap step where no player gets priority. And the cleanup step, which has kind of a special modified version of this same procedure because it's the very last step in the turn. So basically what happens is if all players pass in succession, then the top spell or ability on the stack will resolve. Or if the stack is empty, then the step or phase that you're in is going to end and we'll move to the next one. And so there's a couple of important consequences of this that I'd like to kind of draw some attention to. Number 1 would be that if you have a spell that gets played, every player will have an opportunity at least once, guaranteed, to respond to that spell based on the way that things are structured, because all players would have to have priority and pass priority in a row in order for the top spell on the stack to resolve. So that means that if you play a spell, every player will definitely have a chance to respond to that spell. And it also means that if I play a spell and then someone else responds to that spell, then after that spell that they played in response resolves, everybody gets another fresh round of opportunities to respond to the first spell that I cast before it gets to resolve. So that is actually a change in the rules. There was a time in Magic's history when we used something called a batch system, and let's just say the stack system kind of solved a lot of problems with counterintuitive and non-intuitive results that we had with the batch system. So that is how the game works at this time. So that is what happens when you pass priority. So now let's talk a little bit about how priority interacts with some other game concepts. And we kind of talked about this before on that slide where we talked about like what does and doesn't require priority. But here's the official rule, and there's actually like 2 or 3 times in the CR where it says the same procedure, but like slightly different language. So they spelled it out. This is the passage that comes from the timing and priority section in the comprehensive rules, where it's stating this rule with a emphasis on how it relates to timing and priority. There's some other times where it says this procedure, for example, during the triggered ability section or during the state-based action section where it says this rule with an eye towards how it interacts with those processes. But since we're doing priority here, I figured we might as well take it from here. So anytime a player would get priority, then the game has to do a couple of things before that actually happens. And so the first thing the game does is it checks to see if there's any state-based actions, and if there is, it performs those state-based actions. And then after that, any triggered abilities that have triggered, either during the state-based actions happening or at any other time in between that point and the last time when the game put triggered abilities on the stack, any triggered abilities that need to go on the stack are going to go on the stack. And so then the game does those steps again and again and again. Usually it doesn't need to do them again and again and again, but if for some reason it needed to, it would repeat those steps until it came to a situation where there was no state-based actions and no triggered abilities getting put on the stack. And so then, only after that entire process has been completed, then is the time when the player actually does get priority. So remember, this whole procedure happens anytime somebody is about to get priority. First, the game checks to see if there's any state-based actions. Then the game checks to see if there's any triggered abilities. And only then, after it's completely finished putting all the state-based actions and triggered abilities away, will it be able to give the player who's about to get priority their priority. So there was one other game concept that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned, which is in a multiplayer game using the shared team turn option. So, for example, that would mean a two-headed giant game, for example. Teams have priority rather than individual players. And that kind of doesn't fit in super well with the thing that I said before about how, you can't, have two players cast a spell at the same time. That's still true. You still cannot have two players cast a spell at the same time. But in this case, there isn't, a really well-defined way to, say what happens. What happens is basically, if two players on the same team, the team that has priority, want to cast a spell at the same time, then basically they have to bicker amongst each other to decide who actually gets to go first. That's literally what the actual procedure is in the rules. So yeah, that's how priority interacts with that specific game concept. So I wanted to give a little bit of an example about the triggered abilities and the state-based actions, because I feel like that's something that kind of is confusing for a lot of people if they haven't seen or heard of it before. So this is actually one of my favorite rules questions that I've have ever done, and I did a video on this one a long time ago, very early on in the channel, because this is one of my favorite rules interactions. So the idea is Amy plays a Eternal Witness and Nick controls an Elish Norn, and is it possible for Amy to use the triggered ability of Eternal Witness to return Eternal Witness itself to her hand? And so let's take a look at exactly what's going to go on based on what we were referring to on the previous slide. So after the Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, the game is going to check to see if there's any, because a spell or ability has just resolved, that means that the active player, Amy, is going to get priority, right? Because the Eternal Witness resolves and enters the battlefield, and then because it has resolved, that means that Amy gets priority. Remember, that's one of the different conditions that we had on that slide for how you get priority. So, okay, but remember what we said again on the previous slide. If a player would be about to get priority, then first we have to do a couple things. So first we have to check to see if there's any state-based actions that need to be performed, and of course there is, because the toughness of Eternal Witness will be less than 1 at the time when it enters the battlefield because of the Elish Norn's ability. And so what that means is that there is a state-based action that needs to be performed. Namely, the Eternal Witness will be put into Amy's graveyard because it has 0 toughness or less. So, okay, then after that happens, the next thing that happens before Amy gets priority is the game has to check to see if there's any triggered abilities that need to go on the stack. And what do you know? There's a triggered ability that says when Eternal Witness comes into play, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So that triggered ability goes on the stack. Remember, it triggers at the time when the Eternal Witness actually physically enters the battlefield, but it doesn't get to go onto the stack until the time when the game is actually physically putting those triggered abilities on the stack, which would be during this process, right? So with that being the case, the triggered ability target is not chosen until the time when the triggered ability is going onto the stack. And so because it's going on the stack now, after the Eternal Witness has died due to state-based actions, that means that it is indeed in Amy's graveyard at the time when she's choosing the target for that triggered ability. And so, yes, indeed, Amy would be able to return the Eternal Witness to her hand using that triggered ability, which I thought was a really cool interaction, and certainly not something that that I would expect most people would be able to determine that was the case, unless they actually like had a pretty good understanding of how all this stuff works. So let's contrast that situation with this other one here. So let's say that we instead we don't have the Elish Norn anymore. Instead, what we have is the Eternal Witness, and what we want to do for some reason would be to play the Doomblade against the Eternal Witness, and then return the Eternal Witness to our hand like before. So what do you think? Is this possible? And so for the answer to that question, we'll remember exactly how the process works. So immediately after the Eternal Witness resolves, that means it's time for Amy to get priority, right? Because it's her turn. But we've got a problem. Remember, we have a player who's about to get priority, so that means we go through the procedure again. Now, this time there's no state-based actions to perform, right? The Doomblade is not going to destroy the Eternal Witness via a state-based action. It's just, it just says destroy target non-black creature. So in order for the Doomblade to destroy the Eternal Witness, you would have to like play it and have it resolve just like any other spell. So there's no state-based actions here, but there are triggered abilities that need to go on the stack. And so the triggered ability from Eternal Witness is going to go onto the stack, and that is going to happen before Amy gets priority. So Amy does not have priority to cast a spell until after the triggered ability has gone on the stack. And remember what we said before, triggered abilities have their targets chosen at the time when they're put onto the stack. And so what that would mean is that it is not possible for you to play the Doomblade against the Eternal Witness before you chose a target for Eternal Witness's triggered ability. And so that means that it's not possible to get the Doomblade back or the Eternal Witness back with Eternal Witness's ability in this case. So, okay, that's kind of an example of how priority works. And you saw like the example where we had a continuous effect that led to a state-based action killing Eternal Witness. Those are both things from the you don't need priority to do them categories from that slide that I had a few slides ago. And so with that, you actually were able to return the Eternal Witness to its owner's hand in that case, because the Elish Norn killing the Eternal Witness was not in a way that required priority from the Eternal Witness to die. So that's kind of a cool example that shows how those types of mechanics interact. So all right, now let's get into a little bit more less rules based and more policy based, I suppose, because there are some really important practical considerations when it comes to dealing with timing and priority. And so in the Magic tournament rules, specifically section 4.1, there are several shortcuts that are laid out, and many of them are related to implicit priority passes, right? And so here's a few examples of those. So if you say go or something similar, then what you're actually officially doing is you're offering to pass priority up until the end of the turn. So every time I have a chance to pass priority, I'm passing priority up until the end of the turn. Now, of course, if your opponent does something during that time, you aren't held to the part where you have to pass priority and let it resolve. But in the absence of any play from your opponent, you're offering that I'm going to pass priority at every opportunity until we get to the end of turn. Similarly, this is another one. When a player adds an object to the stack, they're assumed to be passing priority unless they explicitly announce that they intend to retain it. So if you've ever heard someone say hold priority, this is what that is referring to. So let's think about again a little bit about what we talked about for how priority works. Because remember what we said was that every time you play a spell or activate an ability or take a special action, if you had priority when you did that, then that means that you would also get priority first after you have finished that process. So officially, what would happen is, like, if I wanted to play a grizzly bear, I would have to play the grizzly bear, and then I would have priority after I finished playing the grizzly bear. So I would have to pass priority so that then my opponent would have priority. So I would actually technically have to be saying stuff like grizzly bears pass priority every time I played a spell. And of course, nobody ever does that because we have this shortcut here. So unless you specifically say that you are holding priority, then the assumption is that anytime you play a spell or activate an ability, you're passing priority, and your opponent is the one who would actually get the next opportunity to act. Of course, if you have some specific reason to, you would be able to hold priority because that's how it officially does work. But it turns out that in most games of Magic, in most situations, that's not something that would like actually make a lot of sense to do. And so the default assumption is that you're not doing that, and you would have to like go out of your way to make it known that you're breaking that default if there was indeed a situation where that was what you wanted to do. Okay. Another one that's kind of interesting is if a player adds a group of objects to the stack without explicitly holding priority, then they're assumed to be adding them to the stack individually and allowing each one to resolve before adding the next. So, like, let's say I wanted to play, like, 2 lightning bolts, right? Like, my opponent's at 6 life. So, I could just, like, show my opponent 2 lightning bolts and say, like, bolt you twice, for example, right? Like, that's how a lot of people would actually, like, make that play. So, officially, what's going on is I'm playing a lightning bolt, passing priority, waiting for my opponent to pass priority so that that first lightning bolt resolves because it's the top object of the stack. Then, because I would get priority again after that, I would use that opportunity to cast a second lightning bolt and then do the exact same thing. So that's officially the way that would go down. Like sometimes people would think that if I say something like cast 2 lightning bolts, the more logical or maybe more natural way for that to shake out would be for the stack to be like lightning bolt and then my second lightning bolt on top of it. But it turns out that because of this shortcut here, then the other way, the way where you like have one resolve and then play the second one after the first one is resolved, that's the way you're actually officially doing it. And that means that, like, for example, if you do the like play 2 lightning bolts play, your opponent doesn't get to counter both of them with like a double negative, even if they do have a double negative in their hand, because there isn't any time during that play when both of the lightning bolts are actually on the stack. So they cannot both be countered by the same double negative. So, okay. The last one here is kind of another really, really interesting, important one. If an opponent inquires about choices made during resolution, then that player is assumed to be passing priority and allowing that spell or ability to resolve. So here's a couple of examples that go along with that. So for example, you've got the Oblivion Ring, right? So let's say that I'm playing an Oblivion Ring, and my opponent says, okay, target. So what's actually happening there, if we notice, Oblivion Ring is an enchantment, right? Enchantments do not have target. Okay. Non-aura enchantments do not have targets. But this triggered ability obviously does have a target. So officially, when I play an Oblivion Ring against my opponent's Grizzly Bears, what I'm actually doing is playing the Oblivion Ring, waiting for it to resolve. In other words, passing priority, and then waiting for my opponent to pass priority so that the top object of the stack can resolve. Then, once the Oblivion Ring resolves, it enters the battlefield, and that causes its triggered ability to trigger, and that causes, when that triggered ability goes on the stack, then I would choose the target. So if my opponent asks me targets when I play the Oblivion Ring, then based on that thing that we saw in the previous slide, I would be within my rights to assume that my opponent has let the Oblivion Ring resolve, and it's now on the battlefield. Now, if you're a really astute viewer, you might have noticed that that's actually like a little bit outside of what the shortcut is referring to, because, for example, the choice of target is not actually made on resolution of the Oblivion Ring. It's actually made like a little bit after that, technically, but I think most judges would agree that this case does indeed fall under that same philosophy, even if it doesn't strictly fall under the exact text of what that shortcut said on the previous slide. So another one would be the Rith's Charm here. So for example, if I played the Rith's Charm, then any target of the Rith's Charm, or any the knowledge of what mode that I'm choosing, Both of those are choices that I would have to say at the time when I'm casting the Rith's Charm. Those are both choices that are officially part of the process of casting a spell, targets and modes. So what that means is my opponent is 100% within their rights to ask me what the targets are and what the modes are. And they would definitely have access to that information before they would have to like say whether they were responding to the Rith's Charm or what they were responding with. However, if you take a look at this last mode here, prevent all damage a source of your choice would deal this turn. Now that is actually very interesting because the way that's worded, you don't actually choose the source until the Rith's Charm is resolving. So if I played the Rith's Charm and I said I'm using the third mode, if my opponent asked me, okay, what source are you choosing? Then that officially means, based on that shortcut that we saw on the previous slide, that they're okay with letting the Rith's Charm resolve, and they're now asking for information that would happen at the time when the Rith's Charm resolves. So if I say, I'm choosing your like X creature, they can't say, oh, well in that case I'm countering the Rith's Charm. Because they've solicited information that they would not have access to when they're trying to decide whether they want to respond to Rith's Charm. That information is only going to happen, the choice of what source that I'm doing. That information is only something that they would have access to if the Rith's Charm is resolving. And so in asking for that information, based on that shortcut that we saw on the previous slide, they would have forfeited their opportunity to respond to the Rith's Charm. And so that is actually all the questions and like stuff that I have to say about priority. It's a pretty important topic, but it's also one that not a lot of people have a high level technical understanding of. Hopefully now you have a lot more comfortable understanding of exactly how priority works and how it interacts with a lot of other common aspects of the game. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.